Good afternoon. This is the House Appropriations Committee. It is Thursday, January 8th, 2026. It's 2:30 in the afternoon, and we have Emily Byrne, Deputy Fiscal Officer at Joint Fiscal Office, to talk about contingent appropriations that we put in the budget, the current year budget, which we all did last year. And I'm sure you all remember everything about this, but we got to figure out what's happening, what we did, where we are, and all that good stuff. So
Yes.
take it away.
Great. Thank you for having me. For the record, Emily Byrne from the Joint Fiscal Office. This is also, we're going to do the contingent appropriations, but as part of it, the overview of how the closeout process works as well.
Great.
Which I think will be also they're interconnected, and it'll be good to have this preview before we talk about the language in the budget adjustment around the child care contribution special fund. This is the sort of baseline. This is what happens, and we're adding a piece to that process. So this is a good starting point for that. So let me share my screen. Oh, can I share?
Yeah.
It's been 6 months. I forgot how to do.
We're all back in the interview.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So the fiscal year, maybe it should be 25 contingent appropriations, actually. I've already screwed it up. Okay, this is the fiscal 25 contingent appropriations. I'll fix it and post it to the website.
That show that affect the 2026 budget.
That affect the 2026 budget, but they occurred at the close of 2025. Maybe they are 2026. Either way, it doesn't matter. We close the fiscal year, and this is what happened. So, when we talk about where the money for the budget comes from, right, at a high level. So the General Assembly, you all build the budget based off on anticipated revenues and transfers. The estimated revenues are from the January adopted consensus revenue forecast.
Which we're going to get next Friday.
You'll get next Friday, right? So you're setting your revenue number in January, but there's still 6 months of the fiscal year left where anything could happen, right? Also, when you build the budget, we'll note you're accounting for, oh, we're going to do this tax credit or we're going to raise these taxes. That's accounted for when you build the budget. But the consensus revenue forecast is really this is the number, our North Star. This is what we're budgeting to. And sometimes, since it's adopted in January and there's another 6 months left of the fiscal year, sometimes it becomes apparent to those of us that are tracking the revenues, finance management and joint fiscal office, that the actual revenues in a given fiscal year are coming in higher than that adopted revenue forecast. When that happens, we build a contingent list. That's because that revenue isn't official until the fiscal year closes, right? So we know it's coming, but anything can happen, right? Between February and June or May and June in terms of how receipts are coming in. So we don't put it in the actual budget because we don't know, it's not the official adopted number. But once the signals are there, and it's usually at the end of April, after the personal income tax comes in, the legislature in the negotiations with the administration sort of say, okay, we all sort of can see the writing on the wall that the revenue is coming in higher than anticipated, and we should figure out if we want to designate it any differently than what is currently allowed in statute.
And that was last year.
And that was last year.
And again, but as Chris said, right, future past performance does not indicate future success or whatever. Yeah.
Correct. And it has, and what's also challenging is this has happened sort of since COVID. There's been a little bit more uncertainty when April hits about where the revenues are going to land. And we're trying, I think the economists are trying to get sort of back to a steady state of what's happening, but there's a lot going on in the world and in the economy, and they're doing their best to forecast it, right? So there has been this contingency list for the last couple of years, but I remember a time where this was not even.
Right. It was a pipe dream.
Yeah. So the way we do it is we put it in the budget, and it's a list of items in priority order that only get funded in the event that the money shows up, right? So if the list may be $100 million long, and at the end of the fiscal year, there's only $50 million, sort of the first 50 get funded and the other 50. It's not a guaranteed funding. It sort of depends on what we think is going to happen. And generally, we don't know about the contingency list, like if the General Assembly should contemplate a contingency list until April, really. That's the biggest month for the general fund because of personal income taxes. So we're going to go back in time to where we were in April of 2025. Yes. Okay. So in April of 2025, we had the personal income tax, and we know that there is likely going to be an additional approximate over $100 million more than what was forecasted in general fund revenue be deposited in the general fund in fiscal 2025. And at the same time as that happened, we were, 4 or so months into the Trump administration, and we were starting to see signs of uncertainty in the economy. You may remember that's when the sort of tariff conversation was tariffs, no tariffs, tariffs, no tariffs. The stock market was sort of trying to react to what was actually going on. And at the same time, the president had released a budget. It had some suggestions on how to change federal programs that led to some uncertainty in states about how Congress was going to react to the president's recommended budget and what was going to get implemented. And Doge was out, doing what Doge was doing. So there was a lot of uncertainty in terms of the interaction between the federal government and state government. And you all were about to go home.
Oh, that.
And when you're not here and things change, we have to follow different processes to react to it. So in May, one of the things, you all, House Appropriations, get the first bite at the apple on the budget. Senate Appropriations has the benefit of just more time and additional information. When you moved the budget in March, we didn't know generally where whether or not to have a contingent appropriation list. So the House passed budget had no contingent appropriation list. The Senate had the information around the personal income tax receipts and was able to add the contingent list into the big bill. And then the committee
may be discussed at committee of conference too. So it isn't like we don't get a chance to.
Correct.
They just get to start it.
Right. And it changed a fair amount between the two, but the committee of conference ultimately included the contingent list in the final version of the budget. So there's a couple slides of a lot of statutory language. I'm trying to just for thorough. But so in the budget in section B 1101 subpart A, this is what sort of gives finance and management the instructions on, okay, so as you go through the closeout of the general fund, here are the steps you need to follow in this order. So the part in bold is what says, okay, so once you do the first section, and we'll talk about what those first sections are, you're going to notwithstand 32 BSA 308C, figure out how many of the contingent appropriations we can fund based on the amount of undesignated money, and then fund all those contingent appropriations. After you do that, then execute what's outlined in 32 308C. So the first part of the closeout is when finance and this is the first sentence of the section I just showed you. The first thing that finance and management does when it goes to close the books, once all the appropriations have been made and the transfers are done. If there's revenue left over, the first thing they do is make sure that the general fund stabilization reserve is filled. By statute, that is 5% of prior year appropriations. We budget for that. We assume that that is going to occur when we build the budget. So that's the first transaction that they make. They fill the stabilization reserve. The next thing that happens by statute is then this 308C section, which we talk about a lot. So after you fill the stabilization reserve, then we're going to fill the balance reserve, which the balance reserve is the rainy day fund. And the rainy day, and fill the rainy day fund up to no more than 10% of prior year appropriations. There's also
General fund appropriations, not the
general
whole
fund,
budget.
general fund appropriations. So it says put all of it in the balance reserve, except for then in subpart 3, it says of that money that you're going to put in the balance reserve, 25% of it goes to the state employees retirement fund, I believe is what Chris just told you all about. And 25% to this post-retirement adjustment allowance account, which relates to, Chris is going to correct me when I goof this up because I always goof it up. But the retired teachers healthcare fund, no, pension fund, sorry. See, every time.
Both of them are pensions. One is
Both are
teachers
pensions.
and one state employees.
Yeah. So it's anything that's left goes to the rainy day fund, except take that amount of the rainy day fund and send 25 of it to the teacher's retirement, 25% of it to the state employees retirement. What the contingent list where I'm gonna go back up to this original. I'll show you this original language. So the first sentence is put the money in the stabilization reserve. The next sort of section of it is put it in the stabilization reserve, but also take $138.97 million and carry it forward into 26. When we built the FY26 budget, we assumed that there would be $138 million that would be built into the 26 budget. So if they hadn't done that first, then 26 would be out of balance right away. So first take that money, move it to 26. After you do that, if there's anything after that, then fund this contingent list below. And if there's money after that, then do 308C. That's the sort of pensions and the rainy day fund. So this is the pensions and the rainy day fund. So the contingent list, that was the sort of subpart B below that list of instructions, is if there is any unallocated balance determined in the section above, first transfer $8,000 or $8 million, excuse me, to the Communications Information Technology Special Fund. There was a request in the governor's budget to put $8 million to deal with a deficit in that fund last year's budget.
Yeah, they actually asked for 15 million.
Mhm.
We may have done some, but we have allocated 8, and that's when we heard AES earlier this week.
Correct. Yeah, you did part of
That's
it
what this was about.
in the base and you put some of it on the contingency list. Like if the money is available, we will keep paying down the debt. So that was the first thing that happened. The second thing was $50 million was appropriated to the Agency of Administration to be transferred by the emergency board pursuant to 32 VSA 133. I'll talk specifically about what 32 VSA 133 is in the next slide, but that was the emergency board can only transfer appropriations. So this was a mechanism to set aside money that the emergency board could access in the event of something changing at the federal level. And as we'll go into that, but as you're aware,
we took it. Okay.
this is where the emergency board utilized funds to cover SNAP benefits when the government was shut down. After that, after that, $30 million was reserved in the general fund for future appropriation or transfer by the General Assembly to address federal funding shortfalls. And then an additional $30 million was reserved in the general fund for future appropriation or transfer for federal funding shortfalls or other issues that are identified.
So to just pause there for a minute, Emily, those two 30 millions, they're coming to the General Assembly. It's not the Joint Fiscal Committee or not the Emergency Board. So I'm thinking the assumption was that we would be back in session or we would be called into session, and because only the General Assembly can appropriate that money, nobody else can.
Correct. And I have a slide on why this construct, right? Why not just appropriate it all for the emergency board? Why set it up this way? I'll get to that. So this tried to make a little chart. All that got words and legalese about it, but tried to simplify it. So step one, you do 32 VSA 308. Put the money in the stabilization reserve up to 5%. Then you designate the unallocated carry forward, which is the $138 million to be carried forward in the next fiscal year. Then you fund the contingency list in this order, and then follow 308C, 50% to the rainy day fund, 25% to state pensions, 25% to the teacher pension. This is just a quick summary of how it ended, right? So we had 138 million was carried forward. the 118 million on the contingency list was fully funded. And after all of that happened, there was still about $1.9 million left over, almost $2 million left over. That followed the statutory 50% to the rainy day fund, 25% to the pensions, and 25% to the state employees, and 25% to the teacher's pension. So, yeah.
We called it pretty accurately. Those numbers. Which is why that happens in May and not in January.
So.
Yeah, go ahead.
Why did you do the contingent list before the rainy day fund? Because that.
Well, it's not the
based on
balance reserve
percentage.
fund. Right, the balance reserve fund is sort of the mandatory one.
Right, but then there's the rainy day fund. In addition.
Yeah, I think that was, you could have. I'm trying to think, and not knowing exactly why, to do the contingent list and then the rainy day fund, I think it was, we'll put these specific
Assuming you're
reserves.
gonna have enough to all, but. I presume it's because you assumed there was gonna be enough to also do the rainy day fund.
Possibly, then the rainy day fund is just like, in the event there's extra, this is where it goes. Less, not the reserve, that reserve doesn't have a minimum requirement or anything like that. It's
It's
just
not a specified amount. It's just
Correct.
what's there.
whatever's left
Yeah.
goes there.
It's a specific
Yeah,
order of
I always-
operations.
right, that I
It's a
always
specific
thought that-
order of operations that we do this in to ensure that the contingent list gets funded.
Okay, I had just thought the rainy day fund was required, even though it was a lesser amount, that it was required in addition to the balance
It's
reserve.
just the balance reserve.
And
I just think, my memory serves me that we did the, because we had no idea what was gonna happen on the federal level. That contingency list, we had language for that, there were thresholds, if we got to this amount, it went to the ed board, if it went over that, it went to something, and then and then if it was over a certain amount, it went to the General Assembly and the governor would have to call us back, but that was, we wouldn't have like special committees trying to figure out how to fill in for these federal monies that may or may not be there. 'Cause
Right.
that's sort of in
understood that.
addition to that was a separate thing from the contingent list, but we had, the governor could do up to whatever percent, and it's a
Yeah.
lovely little spreadsheet that Catherine and Emily put together by government function. And then over that amount, between X and Y, the joint fiscal committee and the e-board could be involved.
Yes.
And then over that amount, we had to get back, and nothing hit the special
We
session.
never had any, it didn't happen.
It didn't
It
happen.
was really a concern almost all the way through last year, if I recall, and then it really was put language in special just to do this way.
I'm just concerned about the order,
Yeah.
Yes.
because I would have considered the extra money to go to the retirement funds more important than the contingent list.
The, I pulled the language up on the contingent list, and so that the Representative Dickinson, what you were talking about, is in section E 127.2 of the Appropriations Act. That's where it outlines. So only the $50 million would have been accessed by the e-board or the Joint Fiscal Committee in the event that there was reductions. And it was, you're right, there were thresholds around like at what level, who engages at what level of reduction. But it never triggered,
Never happened.
It never happened.
That far.
And one thing I will put a nugget out there, it's one thing we're paying attention to, we'll probably have to talk about, but the language on the 50 million is it can be only used as set forth in that section of this act. So we're going to need to look at in the budget process, how to potentially modify that appropriation. So it's, how it applies in the future.
So do we just keep it there and it would be like a carry forward, right? So we use 6.5 million. Maybe you have a slide.
Jumping ahead, yeah. We're gonna go back to the future, right, which is now about what happened. So we did all that, that was May, right? What happened between now and May around these contingent funds?
Here we are.
Here we are. Still learning, got stuck. So the 50 million appropriated for transfer by the emergency board, right? So it was appropriated to the agency administration to be transferred by the e-board pursuant to the language that is around the e-board.
So the Ministry of Administration can't do anything with it other than transfer it to the e-board.
Right, only the e-board can authorize it to move. And you'll recall back in October, the government shutdown had been going on for a month, almost a month. There was some question about whether or not, or the federal government had signaled that supplemental nutrition assistant payments were going to go out to recipients around the country. The E-board met to try to backstop that program and to help get people resources on October 28th. So they authorized $250,000 of the 50 million to go to the Vermont Food Bank, in part because per the administration's testimony at the emergency board, they had to basically spin up a new program to release these funds. So it was going to take them about a week to get the money appropriated by the emergency board to move. So the food bank grant was the sort of stopgap so that they could issue the benefit. They issued $6.3 million to cover 15 days worth of benefits for folks. And the 6.3 also covered the administrative costs that the agency needed to incur to set up the program and to let recipients know what was happening. So the 50 million, 6.55 is gone, leaving 43.45 in that appropriation, which is still over 85% of the funds that were appropriated. So, and the reason why it's 50 million. So the statute that governs the emergency board, so the section A we can ignore, but so pursuant to Part B, the board has the authority to transfer appropriations made to other agencies and to use the transferred amounts to make expenditures necessitated by unforeseen emergencies. It doesn't happen very often. Sort of before Maria retired and we were doing this and talking with her, there were a few instances back in the mid 20 whatevers where 2012 with LIHEAP, where the purchasing power of the federal LIHEAP grant was not going to get people a benefit that was sufficient enough. So what the emergency board would do was transfer general funds from an area of state government to LIHEAP, and then in the budget adjustment backfill the department where the money came from. But the emergency board has the ability to move. It can't increase appropriations, but it can move them up to 2% of the total general fund appropriated. So it's not, there's a limit on the ability of the emergency board to move money around. Which 2% of the FY 2026 general fund appropriations is $49 million. Now, it would have been a little bit higher had H91 not been vetoed, but 49 is close enough to 50. So that's why the 50 million became the number for that appropriation. The other two tranches were reserved that can only be unreserved by an act of the General Assembly. I think the thinking was at the time was that if we got to a point where we had completely spent the $50 million or had by the emergency board, if they had fully transferred it out of that existing appropriation, or if the triggers that were set up around federal funding cuts were exceeded the level where the Joint Fiscal Committee and the Emergency Board had jurisdiction, there would be money reserved that the General Assembly could access if they needed to come back last fall and make any changes. And to the extent those two $30 million are reserved, they can, I'm jumping ahead of myself. So we've got the two $30 million contingent appropriations. They're reserved in the general fund. So there's, of the reserve, the 2753 reserve and the human services caseload, we now have these two additional reserves that are for these specific purposes. The only way that these funds can be unreserved is through an act of the General Assembly. So the governor can recommend in his budget, he hasn't recommended anything in the budget adjustment, but in the budget could recommend they're unreserved for whatever purpose. We'll know whether or not that's part of his recommendation when you receive the budget the week after next. But for all intents and purposes, that money is there to be accessed if and when the General Assembly deems it appropriate.
So we have to approve how those two $30 million are. Is it possible for us to unreserve some of that for the budget adjustment if we want to?
Yeah. And you could
Into federal
Right, okay.
shortfalls, which we've already experienced, et cetera.
Backfill a little bit.
I'm just asking the question, you know, I'm not sitting here saying, yeah, let's take 60 million and have fun.
I'm not either.
I just want to know mechanically, are we authorized, so we can observe.
Could I reserve it and put it in the
Yes.
rainy day fund if you wanted to? You could. Whatever you
For
want.
the pension.
You could put it in the pension fund. You can unreserve it and put it in the pension. It's sort of your. You and your colleagues.
I could argue why.
I know. We've been well trained.
Yeah.
So and I think that's it.
So the other, the e-board money is, can the e-board unreserve that? How does that play? How do we get to use that money besides for emergencies now that we've put that over there?
So, you would have to modify the appropriation language in the budget or the budget adjustment.
It's appropriate.
But to be transferred to
Well, but
the
yeah.
e-board. They don't get to
We
be.
modify the appropriation to the agency of administration.
Yes, I think you would have to revert the appropriation. If you wanted to change it in FY 26, we would just modify the appropriation, change the amount that gets appropriated in 26, because we're still in 26. If you wanted to let it sit until June and we got into next fiscal year, then you would revert it and then reappropriate it as you saw fit. But we can do.
So that's money for us to play with too. Okay, Wayne.
But we probably should be careful. We don't know that we're out of the woods yet.
Oh, yes. Well, there's a looming government shutdown at the end of this month.
Frugal.
Yes. So I think we set ourselves up really well when we left the session last year. And so we'll see what inspires. Thank you, Emily.
Thank you, Emily.
That was great. Committee, that is what we have for today. So after the floor, we're done, and tomorrow, I think that's right. So floor first at 9:30, and then I look at the agenda, I can tell you exactly what we're doing. We're having an ARPA update from ACCD, and then at 12 o'clock is our very first ever House Appropriations Budget Workshop.
Yeah.
Yay. So,
And is this, I'm sorry, did you say at the beginning that this is going to be part of that workshop?
the contingent appropriations, second workshop, maybe we talk about it? I can't
Okay.
remember.
I'm gonna have you do an exercise on contingent appropriation.
Okay,
To practice your.
Oh, that's right. We're doing that Friday.
okay, all right.
Put some of your colleagues through the.
We're having
Being
interactive
appropriate.
exercises to people who aren't on this committee. You all can do it too, but who've never done this, get to be appropriators and say how they're gonna spend the very limited.
Yeah, we don't need to know anything.